Wow, prynawn da, croeso I Senedd. I've never known such a quiet audience. Perhaps you'd all like to practice being Assembly members. I didn't say that, Assembly members, sorry about that. So can I welcome you to this fantastic occasion? And I really am delighted to welcome you all here, and in particular our very special guest, Julia Gillard. Now, this event is being recorded in its entirety and will be published on the Assembly's website shortly after conclusion this evening. And for the first time, we're also able to stream the event live, so those who couldn't get a ticket can still join us online. Now, please feel free to speak in Welsh or English, both official working languages here at the Assembly. Headsets are available should you need English translation. And I can't explain how it works, but Andrea Byrne is very au fait with these things, so she's going to explain it to you. So I am pleased to see so many of you here at this continuing series of lectures that I've been hosting as part of my Women in Public Life campaign. Now, the campaign is aimed at getting more women in Wales involved in public life by becoming magistrates, councillors, school governors, or seeking other public roles such as membership of public boards, as well as MPs and AMs. We've had some fascinating and varied lectures from human rights campaigner Shami Chakrabarti, broadcaster and loose woman Janet Street-Porter, international scientist Baroness Susan Greenfield, and former New Zealand Prime Minister and UN Ambassador Helen Clark. But I'm quite sure that Julie will be the icing on the cake. Now, many of you will know that I've spent much of the last 4 years encouraging more women into public life and trying to break down barriers preventing them from coming forward or taking that next vital step on the ladder up their career. I started by hosting a series of regional seminars across Wales, culminating in a national conference here at the Assembly, where I was mandated with a very clear plan of action. Now, this Women in Public Life campaign has confirmed to me that we as women have much to be proud of, but we are not tapping into the experience, knowledge and expertise or the perspective that Welsh women could bring to public life. Now, for this reason, as well as this lecture series featuring female role models working in traditionally male-dominated fields, I launched an online portal where training, public appointment information, and news on public life are available all in one place. I also launched a development scheme aimed at providing one-to-one mentoring, training, and role shadowing opportunities at the highest levels in public life. The scheme is halfway through now, and the mentees have already achieved incredible results. They've had a wonderful time, but the mentors are also thoroughly enjoying it. And then last year, I established a Women in Democracy caucus. And the caucus had a clear remit to look at national and international best practice on gender representation in parliaments and to make recommendations to ensure that the Assembly's political parties address the issue. Now, it's chaired by me, and the caucus is made up of one female member from each of the political parties here in the Assembly. A report on the work carried out by the caucus was launched early this year and can be downloaded from the Assembly's website. We're saving on paper. We're not printing anything these days. Now, I am delighted that our guest, Julia Gillard, accepted my invitation to participate in this campaign, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her speak, and I know we will all leave here inspired by her words. Julia, who in 2010 became the first female Prime Minister of Australia and leader of the Labour Party, has delivered a myriad of achievements throughout her successful career in politics. But she really must be saluted for her courage, and the courage she has shown has demonstrated over the years that you've still got to fight every day. And her, she's actually broken down barriers, some of the barriers in Australia anyway, and also stereotyping. And that is what we must try and do in Wales, is to stop the stereotyping so that women are not discouraged from achieving their full potential in politics and, importantly, in other spheres. Now, it's because of role models like Julia Gillard that the next generation of women in Australia and around the world will find it easier to enter a career in politics. Now, this is something which has been central to my campaign from its inception, and I'm confident that the work that together we've been doing, we are beginning to make a real difference. Now, chairing this event this evening will be Andrea Byrne, who is well known to all of you. She's an experienced television journalist and one of the prominent faces on ITV News. Away from the news, Andrea has fronted live political debates, entertainment programmes and lifestyle shows, and she has hosted multiple awards ceremonies and events, including Wales's Political Awards, the Business and the Community Awards, and the Institute of Director Awards. So thank you so much, Andrea, for taking part this evening. Now, before we hear Julia speak, I would just like to share with you a short clip about the portrayal of women in the media and beyond. And after that, Andrea Byrne will introduce the session and our various special guests. I hope you have a fantastic evening. Thank you very much.
That the Prime Minister will agree with the CBI and me.
Imagine you're at Heathrow, as I happen to be, and my office said you better look in the Daily Mail, and I opened it and saw that. That's me, by the way, when I got divorced 10 years ago. And I just wonder, would a man have that kind of coverage?
I think that gender injustice is possibly the biggest injustice in the world if you're talking about a disadvantaged group. Not a minority, a group. But I think it may be the biggest, most systematic, deepest-seated prejudice stroke injustice in the world. And addressing it may also be the key to achieving all sorts of other positive changes in the world in relation to sustainable development and peace and prosperity, and on it goes. I think this is a glaring injustice, and I'm impatient for change.
There are many fewer women than men in public life, and as a result, their voices are not being heard as effectively as they should. As a woman and as a politician, I want to see a fair representation of women in decision-making positions, particularly in public appointments.
Well, hello and welcome, everybody. I should just reassure you that the headset does not mean I am going to sing. I don't know what Julia's got planned. She may have other plans, but no singing from Julia, she assures me. Some inspiring facts in that video, some images for us all to ponder, and some headlines there that were quite shocking, I'm sure you'll agree. A little bit of housekeeping as well to get us started. The obvious point about mobile phones, just make sure they're switched off, please, or on silent so as not to interrupt any proceedings today. And of course, do enjoy spreading the word today on Twitter and on Facebook. The hashtag for Twitter is POWIPL, and you can find @Women of Wales on there as well, and similarly on Facebook. So there'll be no stopping you now. Thank you, Dame Rosemary, for the introduction today and for inviting me here today as well to the Zenith, to such a prestigious event in this series of lectures. The popularity of today's lecture reflects the success of the entire series. It's fantastic to see such a great turnout that it actually had to be moved to a new location here to make sure we could pack you all in, so that's absolutely fantastic. Before I move on to introducing today's speaker in a little more detail, I'd like to take a little moment to reflect on the work of Dame Rosemary Butler as we come to the end of the series of lectures at the moment. She was recognised, of course, by the Queen in the New Year's Honours in 2013, a hugely deserved recognition, of course. And not only does she perform her duties as presiding officer at the Welsh Assembly with dedication, fairness and wisdom, she's also a champion of numerous external causes and institutions, many linked to her beloved Newport. But she is, of course, also an inspiring role model for women in public life herself in Wales and in the UK. She's campaigned tirelessly for more representation of women across all walks of life, all walks of public life, not least here in the Welsh Assembly, of course. And I think that deserves a round of applause before we go on. She's telling me off now, but there we go. All that said then, it will come as no surprise that Dame Rosemary's campaigning and her series of lectures has culminated today in attracting such a high-profile guest speaker to the Zenith in Julia Gillard, former Prime Minister of Australia. I know Rosemary has had her eye on getting Julia here for quite some time, and she's a woman who sticks to her words, sticks to her guns, and she's achieved her aim today, so we're very delighted that Julia can make it and we'll be delivering the guest lecture this evening. Julia, I should probably say a quick thank you as well, because you've managed to bring the weather with you this week. It's not often in Wales, is it, that we experience a little mini heat wave, so I'm thanking you for that. And also today she had a little memento given to her, I know, to go with the warmer climes we've been experiencing this week. A stick of rock was presented to you, wasn't it, as a little gift? But it was no ordinary stick of rock, I should point out. It was a Barry Island stick of rock, a very special stick of rock. Because Julia Gillard is, of course, more familiar with Wales, weather and all, already, of course. She has Welsh roots. She was born just a few miles away from here in Barry, and her father was from Cwmgwrach in the Neath Valley. So perhaps it's appropriate we say to her, welcome back to Wales, rather than just welcome. It's a great pleasure to see you here in the home of Welsh politics, and indeed, welcome to Tim, your partner as well, who is here to hear you speak this evening. Julia's family made the journey to Australia, like so many others from the UK, in the 1960s when she was a small child as one of the £10 POMs. It was a life-changing decision, of course, but it says a lot about people in Wales that we take immense pride in one of our own, however long they may have been away, playing a very important role on the world stage. And Ms. Gillard has certainly done that, reaching the pinnacle of political life in one of the great democracies of the world. In Australia, it soon became clear that this was a woman with talent and ambition. She became president of the Australian Union of Students at Melbourne University. She went on to work very successfully as a lawyer, becoming a partner in a firm. Moving on to politics, Julia became the Chief of Staff to John Brumby and then won a seat in Parliament in 1998. In the 12 years which followed, she served in several high-profile ministerial roles, and in 2010 she became the 27th Prime Minister of Australia. In her time in office, some of you may remember Julia Gillard emphasised the importance of her Welsh roots, paying tribute to her Welsh father not long after his passing, quoting Dylan Thomas to reflect on his spirit in a very moving speech in Parliament. And it is indeed heartening that she largely attributes her success in politics and public life to her parents' Welsh values. Now, not long after that tribute, Julia also made another speech in Parliament, one which I'm certain many of you here today will be more than familiar with. It has since become famous the world over. It has become known as the misogyny speech, of course, and it was directed at her opposite number, Tony Abbott. Indeed, I understand it has redefined the word in Australia's leading dictionary. And if you haven't seen it, do watch it. I assure you it is both inspirational and evocative. As I'm sure she will go on to say, Julia reached the top despite being at the receiving end of some sustained and vindictive criticism that was directly related to the fact that she was a woman in a position of authority in a so-called man's world. The fact that she faced these attacks with fierce determination and a will not to be patronised, belittled or shouted down shows that she was prepared to face ignorance and aggression, and shows her strength of character and steely resolve to see through her beliefs. It is also an inspiration for women, and indeed men, who believe in the values of a society that is fair, equal, and appreciative of the contribution that women can make to public life. So without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Julia Gillard.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you to Andrea for that very generous introduction. Can I also acknowledge Dame Rosemary Butler? Thank you for your generosity to me today. We have spent a great deal of time together and it's been absolutely delightful. But much more importantly than that, thank you for being such a role model for women in public life in Wales and for creating this lecture series. Hard problems do not get solved unless they are thought about, discussed openly, and conclusions on action for the future are drawn. Thank you for enabling women to have this vital forum for working through how to eradicate the stubborn blight of gender inequality in our world. I feel honoured and delighted to be here. I did leave Wales, having been born here. I left here in 1966 as a 4-year-old, so yes, you can calculate my age. And here I am, almost 50 years later, returning as a former Prime Minister to discuss what I've learned along the way. So for me, this evening has a wonderful sense of life coming full circle. In this proudly bilingual society, I should clarify at this point that I am speaking English, just a very Australianised version of it. There's no point desperately tapping your translation device. I hope not too much is getting lost in translation. Tonight we have gathered to wrestle with what I referred to in my book as the curious question of gender. Certainly one of the reasons I think the word curious is apt is because I did not grow up in a household of gender stereotypes. My family, Welsh by birth and Australian by choice, consisted of my father and mother, my sister Alison and I. At every turn, Alison and I were taught to think with ambition about our lives, to aim for university education, for a good career, to seek out and maximise the impact of the kinds of opportunity for learning that my parents had been denied. My father was born in a farmhouse in Cwmgrak, the 6th child of a coal mining family. Delightfully, I have visited his younger brother Terry, the last child, the 7th, on this trip. My mother was born in Barry, one of 4 children, 2 of whom did not survive childhood. My parents met in Barry, where both were working in the police force. There began a love story to last a lifetime, a marriage that endured for more than 50 years until death did part John from Moira. My mother, at 87 years old, is still fond of telling stories of her life in Wales. When my parents took our family to Australia, they brought with them very practical Welsh values, a preparedness to work hard, The goal of ensuring that life for the next generation, for my sister and I, was one of greater opportunity, a belief in the power of education to transform life's chances. While Wales was remembered fondly and much celebrated in our family home, there were aspects of their childhoods that both my father and mother wished had been different. My father, simply because of poverty, was not able to attend school beyond the age of 14. Despite having passed the 11+ examination so well that he was offered a scholarship, his family could just not afford to have him at school. They needed him working. My mother was very unwell as a child, with interruptions to her schooling career that she was never able to make up. While both of them throughout their lives improved their own education through voracious reading and some formal courses of study, there was always a wistful sense of what if? What if we had completed school? What if we'd been able to go on to university? What would the other life not lived have been like? Burned into my sister and I from our earliest days was our parents' love of learning and the sense that every day of education was a privilege to be cherished. So while schooling brought me some childlike skirmishes with the question of gender, the primary school art teacher who required only the girls to clean up the mess post-class, the high school requirement that the girls study cooking, sewing and laundry, while the boys did woodwork, metalwork and electronics, I really grew up in an environment thankfully free of gender stereotypes. My parents always taught Alison and I to think big. Given my schooling was undertaken in the 1960s and 70s, this perspective about girls was not the ubiquitous outlook of the times. Many girls of my generation would have been taught in their family homes to think no further than being a wife and being a mother as the sum total of their future. Thankfully, I was not. In my family home, alongside valuing education, my parents had bred into my sister and I a very Welsh-style belief in fairness and equity. Politically, my parents placed their faith in the Labor Party. At work, they always ensured they had a union ticket. Alison and I understood that government mattered. It made a difference to how good our school was. We actually appreciated that Labor government mattered. It was Labor's great leader, Gough Whitlam, who abolished university fees, clearing the way for young people like us to enrol. Consequently, when a Conservative government proposed major cutbacks to education when I was in my second year of university, it felt natural and just to become involved in a campaign to oppose them, to fight for access and to fight for fairness. The collective voices mobilised in that campaign were heard, and the government backed down on some, but not all of its cuts. From then on, I was hooked on the belief that you could fight for education and win. Campaign activism joined the belief I had learned in my family home that education was a right worth fighting for. So it was that love of education, a belief in fair access to opportunity, a set of values brought from Wales to Australia that explains how a girl from Barry ultimately rose to become Australia's first female Prime Minister. Yes, it's an unlikely story, but it's my story. In the student movement, I learned about the ethos of feminism. Intellectually, I came to understand that while women hold up half the sky, a saying of the times, the social and economic system was not delivering half the benefits of society to women. I always rejected the more radical strands of feminism in favour of being involved in a practical movement for change, for eradicating discrimination. As I pursued my life post-university as a lawyer, it seemed for a tantalising moment that the issues of gender discrimination, at least in politics, had started to resolve. These were the days in which Joan Kirner, a crusading Labor woman, rose to be the first woman Premier of the state of Victoria, in which I then lived. Joan led a government with a significant number of women ministers in portfolios. but my dreams of a self-correcting world in which historic gender bias just melted away were dashed. When the Kerner government was badly defeated at the 1992 election, it became apparent that many of those women had been in marginal seats. When the Labor Party was forced back to its bedrock vote, it was the women who disproportionately lost out. Joan Kerner then devoted her attention to creating an affirmative action target for the Labor Party, ensuring that an increasing share of seats, including safe seats, went to women. I was honoured to work with her in that campaign. I also worked alongside her to create an organisation to financially support and mentor Labor women candidates called Emily's List. When I entered federal parliament in 1998, I came to the starting gate of my political career, a seasoned feminist and a campaigner for women's rights. Yet personally, I had not felt the sharp sting of gender discrimination. Consequently, I was somewhat taken aback by the way in which gender discrimination so raised its ugly head when I was Prime Minister of Australia. As I said in my final address as Prime Minister, gender doesn't explain everything about my Prime Ministership. It doesn't explain nothing about it. It explains some things. And it is for the nation to think in a sophisticated way about these shades of grey. Now, given the book and the movie, I have had plenty of opportunity to regret my precise choice of words. But on this curious question of gender, there are slippery issues to try and catch hold of. Are there any facts to cling to? Well, one is that our brains recognise gender in 200 milliseconds. In fact, research has shown the first characteristics we compute about the people we meet are gender and race. If you feel like you notice a person's height or weight or clothing first, you're simply wrong. In this very tiny split second, our brain does not impose on us any stereotyping of what gender means. Our culture and experiences do that. Sheryl Sandberg, in her 2013 New York Times bestseller Lean In, Women, Work and the Will to Lead, has popularised the results of a Harvard Business School case study where the story of achievement by a business person was given to students to read. Half the students read a version where the business person was a woman. Half read exactly the same story, except that the business person was a man. A poll was then conducted on how likeable the business person was and whether the student would want to work with them or for them. The students found the man likeable and the woman selfish and not likeable. Disturbingly, both the male and female students came to these conclusions. As Sandberg points out, success and likability are positively correlated for a man, but not for a woman. The results of this study, this was with young people at Harvard, the results of this study and many others like it are driven by cultural stereotypes that live so deep in our brain we are not really conscious of them. Distilled crudely and simply, these are that men think, women feel, that men are to be judged on their actions, women on their appearance, that men lead while women nurture. These stereotypes whisper to us that a woman leader cannot be likeable because she must have given up on the nurturing and feeling. Of course, these stereotypes are not immutable. The fact that today's Australia is a vastly different and better place for women than yesterday's shows us that change is achievable. This means that it is possible for the generations to come to take a better, more balanced approach to gender questions than we have reached to date. But learning for tomorrow requires us to work patiently and carefully through the complexities. With regard to that work, I have a special perspective, having been at the centre of the gendered reactions to my Prime Ministership. I am conscious too of my own subjectivity. Having had much heat directed at me, having myself become heated on the topic, my perspective may well be too close to be as dispassionately analytical as one should be when dealing with these complex problems. What I can do is describe how I lived and how it felt. Sometimes it felt lonely. I was so visibly the oddity. As Prime Minister, day after day, time after time, I would find myself in a room, often a business boardroom, where I was the only woman, apart perhaps from a woman serving coffee or food. Because politics at senior levels in our nation has almost always been the pursuit of men, the assumptions of politics have been defined around men's lives, not women's lives. It is assumed a man with children brings to politics the perspective of a family man, but it is never suggested that he should be disqualified from the rigours of a political life because he has caring responsibilities. This definitely does not work the same way for women. Even before becoming Prime Minister, I had observed that if you are a woman politician, it is almost impossible to win on the question of family. If you do not have children, and I do not, then you are characterised as out of touch with mainstream lives. If you do have children, then heavens, who's looking after them? I had already been chided by Liberal Senator Bill Heffernan for being deliberately barren, and then had to stomach reading follow-up pieces like the one entitled Barren Behaviour in The Australian, one of our two national daily newspapers. That piece stated, and I quote, "At the Junee Abattoir, manager Heath Newton knows what happens in the bush to a barren cow. It's just a case where if they're infertile, they get sent to the vet to get checked and then killed as hamburger mince," he says. In the Kimberley region near Broome, where Heffernan issued his public apology for his remarks on Wednesday night, the barren cows even have a name, killers. It's the ultimate fate of an animal that can't breed. Before becoming Prime Minister, I'd also worked out that what you were wearing will draw disproportionate attention. It did when I became Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Pleading, "I like to wear suits," or "I've been on the road for days," simply did not cut it. Undoubtedly, a male leader who does not meet a certain standard will be marked down, but that standard is such an obvious one: of regular weight, a well-tailored suit, neat hair, television-friendly glasses, trimmed eyebrows. Being the first female Prime Minister, I had to navigate what that standard was for a woman. It is galling to me that when I first met NATO's leader, predominantly to discuss our strategy for the war in Afghanistan, where our troops were fighting and dying, it was reported in the following terms, quote, "The Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, has made her first appearance on the international stage, meeting the head of NATO, Anders Rasmussen, in Brussels. Dressed in a white short jacket and dark trousers, she arrived at the security organisation's headquarters just after 9 a.m. European time and was ushered in by Mr Rasmussen, the former Danish Prime Minister and NATO Secretary-General," end quote. This article was written by a female journalist. It apparently went without saying that Mr Rasmussen was wearing a suit. This gender stereotyping was at the very benign end compared to much of what I faced. Ditch the witch on placards, the ugly ravings of "women are destroying the joint" from a conservative and cantankerous radio shock jock, the pornographic cartoons circulated by an eccentric bankrupt, the vile words on social media. It would have been one thing if it had been confined to society's margins, but it was mainstreamed by the opposition, business identities and the media. During hard political fights, the gendered insult became a convenient cudgel. As early as 1975, in her book Damned Whores and God's Police, Australian feminist and author Anne Summers explained that during our nation's history, women were always categorised in one of these two roles. It felt to me as Prime Minister that the binary stereotypes were still there, that there were only two choices available, to be a good woman or a bad woman. As a woman wielding power, with all the complexities of modern politics, I was never going to be portrayed as a good woman. So I must be the bad woman, a scheming shrew, a heartless harridan, or a lying bitch. This binary world of good women and bad women, the one-dimensional portrayal, meant it was impossible to be received as a full human being, with all the complexities that come with being neither perfect nor evil. Living in the middle of all this name-calling and double standards, I had to harden my heart. As a younger person involved in politics, I'd watched the trials and tribulations of women in politics. I saw that being viewed as the golden girl, the one on the pedestal, was a dangerous business. There was such a long way to fall. From watching the experiences of these women and from politics in general, I realised the folly of feeling good about yourself on a day of good media headlines and badly about yourself on a day of shocking ones. On both days, you would be the same person. You needed a sense of self that was not reliant on media positioning. I joined this learning to my natural sense of who I am. I've never defined myself through the approval in the eyes of others. Everyone likes to be liked, I'm no different. But I've always had an inner reserve, a sense of purpose that drove me on, even when I did not feel liked. During my Prime Ministership, this grew stronger. It had to. I toughed it out. I refused to let any negativity get to me. I could watch or be briefed about the worst of things and respond relatively dispassionately. It is not that the sense of anger and hurt was not there, I just did not let it rule me. I congratulated myself on how well I was coping. But looking back on it, I see that if you swallow hard, bite your tongue, check your emotions too often for too long, sometime, somewhere, those emotions will burst through. For me, that moment was the now famed misogyny speech. That speech brought me the reputation of being the one who was brave enough to name sexism and misogyny. And it brought with me all the baggage that stops women naming sexism and misogyny when they see it. I was accused of playing the gender card, of playing the victim. Dumb, trite arguments that entirely miss the point. Someone who acts in a sexist manner, who imposes sexist stereotypes, is playing the gender card. It is that person who is misusing gender to dismiss, to confine, to humiliate, not the woman who calls it for what it is. Calling the sexism out is not playing the victim. I've done it and I know how it made me feel. Strong. I'm nobody's victim. It is the only strategy that will enable change. And after all, what is the alternative? Staying silent, so the sexism is never named, never addressed, and nothing ever changes. In my final speech as Prime Minister, I said, I am absolutely confident it will be easier for the next woman and the woman after that and the woman after that. I remain confident and proudly so. I would also urge women and girls who have a sense of purpose and passion to change their nations for the better to get involved, to go into politics. It is not an easy road. There will be ups and downs, but the ability to pursue what you believe in, to implement change, is rewarding beyond measure. The delight of that outweighs any negativity, absolutely. But should women and men in Australia or anywhere else in the world sit back, assuming it will be easier for the women who come next? No. We have an obligation to be working through the complexities so that for the next woman Prime Minister, business leader, union leader, military leader, factory manager, office manager, it will be easier than it has been before. It requires women and men day by day to point out sexism when they see it and change it. Persistence, constancy in this purpose is required from all of us, and it will be rewarded by the creation of better societies. How do I feel about it all now? Well, not bitter, energised and eager to see the change that must come. And here in Wales, I must confess, a little wistful. Having had the delightful opportunity of travelling in Wales since last Friday, my own connection and history has been ever present in my mind. I have spent some time musing about the other life not lived. What if my parents had not migrated? What if I'd grown to adulthood here in Wales? What would my life's journey have been? Unanswerable questions. But maybe, just maybe, the other life not lived would still have brought me here tonight, talking about the fairness and justice of gender equality, talking about my profound belief that merit is equally distributed between the sexes, and if you look at any institution, a legislature, a judicial bench, a corporate board, and you don't see around half men and half women, then it must mean that women of merit have missed out. Talking about the need to change our world brings us together tonight, and talking about it we do need to do. We need to do it, so whether it is a girl in South Sudan at risk of a forced marriage, or a woman in Wales going for a promotion, or a young girl in Australia dreaming of being the next woman Prime Minister, their lived experience ends up being one of equality and opportunity. Whatever pathway brought us to this moment, that's certainly a world worth fighting for. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Julia. I'm sure everybody will agree that was another inspiring speech. Another round of applause for Julia Gittler.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Julia has kindly agreed to answer some of your questions for the next, I think, half an hour or so, maybe more, if we've got time. So just a little bit of, Rosemary told me I was going to be the one to tell you about the headsets, so I shall. They're very easy. You just need to snap them open if you need the Welsh translation at any point, and use them like that. So the volume will be fine, the channel will be fine, so you just literally need to put them on. There's some roving microphones. If you can all put your hands up with your microphones, they're about in the room there. So if you could just put your hands up for questions, and then when we do come to you, if you could just introduce yourself and speak in Welsh or English, but if you are speaking in Welsh, give hopeless people like myself, a chance to put the headset on, so I can translate the question as well for Julia. Okay. Lady on the end here. Have you got a question for us, madam?
I'm Karen Ross. Just visiting down from Newcastle. Couldn't resist coming down to hear you speak.
Thank you.
Julia, thank you very much for that. We know about the misogyny speech, but before that, can you just say something about how the media have treated you, or rather your views on the media's representation of you as a woman parliamentarian as well as the Prime Minister?
Well, as I tried to summarise in the speech, there was all sorts of gender stereotyping, from the less flagrant to the more subtle, but it was constantly there. I made the assumption that the sort of maximum reaction about gender would be in the first few months of my Prime Ministership, so the maximum fascination on appearance, the maximum amount of the go-girl reaction, the maximum amount of the I'm uncomfortable with a woman leader reaction, that would play out in the first few months, and then, you know, it would kind of wash out of the system, and my prime ministership would be judged solely on capability questions and political decisions being made. What I actually found was the gendered abuse grew over the period of being Prime Minister, and that's because inevitably when you're in the business of politics you have to make decisions. Tony Blair is fond of the saying, if you decide, you divide. Inevitably that's true in modern politics, and I was managing some quite hot political contests. And so in the heat of those political contests, the gendered stereotype, the gendered insult, actually came more and more to the fore. So the learning I've taken from that is you can't assume that this will self-correct or wash out of the system. You've actually got to call it out, point to it, name it, and try and change it as early as possible. And it's not just women who should think about that. I think it's very important that there are male champions for change who are actually prepared to point to gendered conversations or insults and say, you know, call them for what they are. So even some of the footage we saw in the little video, which I thought was very powerful, it would have been very useful, I think, for a leading male identity in UK life, whether that's a politician or a business leader or even a male celebrity, to say, you know, I'm not taking a side in politics, I'm not advocating Conservatives versus Labor or whatever, but I'm just pointing to this example and saying we don't have our democratic conversations like this, so let's not do that again. I think that would be a very powerful thing. So the media, I think, is going to, you know, play with these stereotypes as long as they feel no backlash for doing so. And we're only going to generate that backlash by more and more people being prepared to name it and shame it. There was an online organisation that came together during my Prime Ministership called Destroying the Joint, hashtag Destroying the Joint. And that was because one of our shock jocks said about me and the first ever female police commissioner in the state of Victoria, these women are destroying the joint. And so the wits quickly got on social media and it became a network that to this day is still doing some pushing back on gendered stereotyping in Australian media. So that kind of intervention, I think, can be very powerful.
Does that answer your question? Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you.
Just in the middle there.
Hi, you can hear me, can you?
Yes.
Yeah. My name's Fiona Morgan. I work at Cardiff University, where we have quite a few women, but maybe not as many as we would like. But I was going to ask, you've talked about the media. In Australia, my understanding is that you have two rather large media organisations, one of which is headed up by everybody's favourite, Rupert Murdoch. Do you think that has an impact on the way in which gender is addressed in the media in Australia?
Well, I'm from the city in Australia. I grew up in Adelaide and I've returned to Adelaide post-politics. I'm from the city that gave Rupert Murdoch to the world, so whether or not you want to thank Adelaide for that, I'll leave to you, but his father ran the newspapers in Adelaide, both the morning and evening newspaper, and from that quite humble beginning, Rupert Murdoch created his global empire. We live in one of the most concentrated media markets in the world, disproportionately Murdoch owned, and there's one other newspaper chain, Fairfax, and it's got other media interests as well as the newspapers. I think there's one thing, or a couple of things that flow from the concentration. but really the bigger picture is one of change in the media landscape. So the sort of speed, the hyper-metabolism of this internet age for media means everybody feels like they've got to scream a bit louder to be heard, scream louder and scream quicker. So the content is generated more quickly, it's of less depth, and in accordance with the scream louder, the headlines are more inflammatory, the commentary is more inflammatory, the news reporting often more skewed to one direction or another. I think that's a worldwide phenomenon. In Australia's media market, with its concentration, that worldwide phenomenon then reverberates very loudly because there's not much contestability. So when one newspaper chain has decided to go hard in one direction, then there's not much contestability. So the screaming gets amplified because there's actually less room in the debate for a variety of voices. So it means that you get a fair bit of bully boy culture because there's only so many media outlets. If one of them gets a set against a politician, then that's a big thing. It means there's less correcting of factual errors, there's less pressure to correct factual errors, and I suspect there's a less reflective dialogue about the nature of the media and its impact on politics. You actually need some new voices and contestability to make that happen. Now, thankfully, we have seen some new media entrants, including having an Australian version of The Guardian, for which I write, but we're still suffering with some of the consequences of that concentration and then this bigger issue of the sort of hypermetabolism of the age in which we live.
And what do you think the answer to changing that in the long term is?
I actually think we're going to change it. Consumers are going to change it. I've joked with people in Australia that this current media age reminds me of the time that we first had all-you-could-eat restaurants in Australia. Now, you might think that this is a very strained analogy, but I do remember the days when you first had all-you-could-eat restaurants. And everybody went a bit mad, didn't they? Like, you just went mad. You're standing by the donut machine. You don't even want a donut. You don't even like donuts. But somehow, you've paid and it's all you can eat. So you've got to stand by the donut machine. On and on it went. And we finally decided, having lived through that, that, you know what, when it comes to food, I'd like a little bit less. I'd like it more customised to my taste. I'd like it higher quality. And I think where we are with the media now, where we feel like we've got to absorb and click our way through everything, that as consumers we're going to get past this stage and think, you know what, I'd like to have less, better depth, more on the issues I'm interested in. And when we as consumers start that choice, then that will drive the media outlets to respond. So there will always be the, quick click news, heavens, I need to know what, Brad Pitt's done today and what Kim Kardashian's done today. I absolutely need to know that. I need to know who's not playing for my footy team on Saturday because they're injured. Click, click, click. There'll always be that. But for the, news that we really care about, terrorism, education, health, climate change, the future of our world, I think people will be looking for a bit more depth.
Maybe a bit of a digital diet before we get to that point.
That's right. We'll have to do the detox.
Any more questions from the floor? Just here on the left.
Thank you. My name is Katie Marsden. Full disclosure before I start this, I haven't actually read the Sheryl Sandberg book that you mentioned, Lean In, but I did read an article criticising the book for putting the onus on women to change their behaviour to fit in and get on. And I just wondered what you thought about that, and also whether you found yourself doing that throughout your career. I know already early days in mine, but I find myself changing my behaviour sometimes. So I'd just be interested on your thoughts on that.
Yeah. When you read Sheryl's book, I think it's a very good book, and she unashamedly says she's coming at the issues from one perspective. So, if we look at, why aren't there more women in politics? Why aren't there more women on corporate boards and the like? There's sort of two theories that are often thrown into competition. One theory is that women don't put themselves forward and push hard enough, lean in, to use Cheryl's terminology. Another is even when women do push themselves forward, do try hard to get the job, get the political position, get on the corporate board, that they get stopped, that there are structural and other barriers in the way. And Cheryl in her book acknowledges that both those things are important, but then unashamedly says, I'm going to focus on the lean in bit. For my public advocacy, I've tended to focus on the structural bit. And I think we need to stop seeing these things as you've got to believe one or the other. I think both are in play. Certainly Cheryl cites a range of research that leads you to the conclusion that women do tend to undervalue themselves and their experiences and don't put themselves forward. So she's got in there experiments they've done where they, test whether or not men and women are going to apply for a particular job, and a woman will say, oh, I can only do 9 of the 10 things that are on the duties list, so I'm not ready for it. Whereas the men will say, I can blitz 2 of the 10 things on the duties list and I'll learn the other 8 when I get the job. So she can forensically point to that, and that does mean we have to change women's mindsets. But I actually think even if every woman flung herself forward, there would be these structural barriers that politics and business often use a set of networks to work out who's going to be the next person. Those networks have tended to be male networks, and so they find the next man. There's a valuing of longevity at task and unbroken time at task, and women are much more likely to break their working time for childbearing, child rearing. There's a valuing of the stay late culture, of the go out for a drink culture, and often that's not inclusive of women, or women can't opt into it because they have other responsibilities. And so until we think about those kinds of barriers and start breaking them down, we're not going to see true equality.
And just picking up on that question, did you find yourself at any stages of your career slipping into that I've got to change to fit in?
Look, across my career, I've been in a number of quite Boise environments. Traditionally, my political party, the Australian Labor Party, was a quite Boise environment, and the law firm I worked for, which is now actually trading here in the UK, and I saw it advertised on TV, Slater and Gordon. Historically, not now, but when I was there all those years ago, quite a Boise environment. And so I think there are some behaviours that you adopt to make your way in that world. But in some ways, I've found that for all of its cut and thrust, in some ways that culture is more malleable than a let's stand up and be very polite because the ladies are in the room culture, which is far subtler and more insidious and often harder to therefore contest and come to grips with. Now maybe that's just me and how I react personally, but I've found ways of navigating through those more Boise cultures quite easily. Not easily, but I've obviously made it. I sometimes think it's harder when you've got the man sitting next to you patting your arm saying, oh, it just must be so hard for you, which is really sort of fueled by an assumption, probably you're not up to it, but he kind of thinks he's being nice. Sort of unpacking that, I think, is in many ways a whole lot harder.
So it's learning different coping mechanisms. Any other questions from the floor? Lots of questions. I've done this side. So let's go over to there, right over there in the red jackets, madam.
Do we have to stand or is it okay? Hello?
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can, thank you.
I'm Shivani Roy, coming from Colwyn Bay. I'm the mayor of Colwyn Bay, just a tiny politician in North Wales. I'm very much fascinated by your life story, and thank you very much for coming. So my question is very, very short, and my apology to men assembly members here. Do you think it is a mere wish list for us to have a Wales First Minister in next Wales government?
Do you have, sorry, a...
Do you think it is our mere wish list to have a female female First Minister in next Wales government?
Now, I've still got enough of my jungle skills from politics to avoid that question, I think. I know that you have an election coming up, and I know that a number of women who have served in the Assembly, including Dame Rosemary, will not be contesting the next election. And, you know, there comes a time when it's time, and a life beyond beckons. I hope that, you know, the political parties involved, as well as the electors involved in Wales, do think about gender equality as they prepare for that election and fielding the best possible team. And the best possible team, it seems to me, must end up being half men and half women. And it's when you've got, in terms of women, you know, coming through for leadership positions, whether it's First Minister, Prime Minister, President or whatever, we're only going to get to genuine equality where men and women are taking those positions roughly half of the time if we've got a big starting class. You know, politics has got a lot of ups and downs, oddities about it, which means that even, you know, the most talented person can start and not end up ever serving a day as a minister, let alone as a First Minister or Prime Minister. So to have women come through, you've got to have a large number of women actually in the legislature itself, or you won't have women make it at the top. So I think the prime thing is to make sure that the class of people who come into this place are around half men and half women, and then that will flow through to who serves as ministers and who ultimately gets to serve as the First Minister.
Very diplomatic answer.
Thank you. Phew.
Just looking to see whether we've got any men with any hands up there. I don't know whether they're all being too shy this evening. On the front row here, madam. Just wait for the microphone to come your way.
Helo, Gwen o Dafydd ydw i. Dwi'n anogydd arweinyddiaeth a siarad yn gyhoeddus. Ydych chi, dyma fy nghwestiwn i, diolch yn fawr iawn, mae'n bleser mawr i fod yma yn eich cwmni chi heddiw. Dwi wedi gweld eich gwaith chi ers blynyddoedd gyda lot fawr o edmygedd. Fy nghwestiwn i yw, ydych chi wedi cael anogydd, sef coach, yn ystod cyfnodau heriol eich gyrfa, ac os na gafoch chi, sut oeddech chi yn rhannu y baich o'r holl darfu a bwlio rhywiaethol? Pwy fuodd o gymorth i chi, a byddech chi yn anogydd? Diolch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah,
did you pick up on the question? Okay,
yes,
great.
I did. Thank you for the question. I've never in my life had a coach or that sort of formalised relationship, but I certainly had a number of people who were mentors for me and, you know, were sort of touchstones when things got tough. One of them was the woman I mentioned in my speech, Joan Kirner, who was the first woman to lead the state of Victoria. Who I got to know not as some big-time politician, but because when I was in a shared student household, one of the people in that household was her son, Dave Kirner. So I got to know Joan, and she went on to become the first Premier of Victoria, and she stayed in good touch. Joan she was retired by then, she took to the iPad with a great deal of alacrity and would send me emails constantly, supportive, encouraging, and thankfully they weren't all FOI'd because full of swear words and foul language about people who were giving me grief. So I found that very sustaining. Obviously my family, Tim, very sustaining. One of the things about being the first is, you know, there's a limit to who can guide you on the path, because kind of by definition you're the one stamping the path out. But I also found exchanges with other women leaders around the world, very sustaining. And when you do go to things like the G20, I mean, I've joked that it's, just like everything else, the girls go to the bathroom together and have a good chat. That does happen at things like the G20, and when we do those kinds of things, often we're sharing observations about gender and the media and that kind of thing, so you get to have those exchanges too. So that for me was a set of supports that really mattered.
It was interesting, you were sharing earlier on today that you also had a coping mechanism of a piece of paper you used to keep in your pocket. Would you mind elaborating on that a little?
Yes, I talk about this in my book, My Story, but I was became friendly, I'm still a friend of Alan Milburn, who served as a health secretary in Tony Blair's government. He became a campaign consultant for Australian Labor. He came and worked on our 2007 campaign, which took us from opposition to government. I was joking earlier today, I think he then returned to the UK and wrote a book entitled something like How I Won the Australian Election by Alan Milburn. A couple of other people played a role, but anyway. And when I became Prime Minister, I talked to Alan, and Alan said, you'll have everybody at you, this will be an incredibly busy, pressurised period, but you should take the time out to write on a couple of sheets of paper what your purpose is, why you want, why you've come to this office of Prime Minister, what it is that you've come to do. And I did do that, and I did keep it with me, and I found that in the kind of, worst of days when pressures were intense, it was very steadying to get it back out and read it again and remind yourself about what you'd set out to achieve and why you were there. And I think that that's probably good advice for people who are engaging in other occupations with different sets of pressures. But in our pressurised world, you don't have to be in politics to feel buffeted around, and it was a very good defence mechanism against getting blown off course by events.
Making sure you retain that sense of self that you were talking about a little earlier on.
Yes.
Anyone else? Madam here in the blue scarf at the front.
Hello, my name is Sheena Duggan. Just one question. As Rosemary's doing the support for women in public life here, are you going to be setting something up like similar in Australia?
In some ways we don't need to. The Labor Party's got a set of mechanisms, the affirmative action rule, the Emily's List structure to support Labor women. There have been some endeavours in the Australian Parliament to bring women together, and I think that they really need to be fostered by the women who are there. I think once you leave politics, it's hard to come back and try and do that bringing together of women. I think women in the system today have to work their way through to that. But there's a lively dialogue in Australia about women and leadership, not just in politics, but in corporate Australia. I think my experiences have helped fuel that dialogue, but it's not just my experiences. It's a set of frustrations about women in corporate boards and women as chief executives and the numbers that we're seeing. So I'm actually an optimist about how all of that energy is going to keep sparking in Australia. And of course, given my special status in relation to that debate, I intend to play a role in it and do at a number of events and networks in Australia for women.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm conscious that we need to get to the back of the room. Anyone at the back who has got a burning desire to ask a question? We haven't got to you yet. Over here on the right at the back, sir. Hello.
Hello,
Robert.
Good evening. It's Robert Lloyd Griffiths. In your travels around the world, are there countries that you see, yes, they've got it right here, or they're much better than we are, or much better than other countries? And what might those countries be, and why are they getting it right?
I can't think of one country that you would point to and say they've got everything right. But you can certainly point to countries that have had far more women serve at high political level. And when you see some of those nations, it becomes very clear that, you know, first woman, big reaction, second woman, less of a reaction, and as the number of women increases, the reaction to it being a woman gets less every time. And so that gives me a great deal of confidence that we are going to get to a stage where people don't even remark on the fact that, you know, is this the fourth woman or the fifth woman to serve as Australia's Prime Minister? I can't be bothered remembering, and who cares anyway. When we've got to that stage, then we will have got to a great deal of equality that we don't have now. I think, you know, on various barriers that keep women out of public life, the political party pre-selection structures, the way in which the media treats women, some of the impediments or barriers for women who are caring for children. You know, some of those things have to necessarily be solved place by place because the challenges are different. And I think there's, you know, things that can be learned from various nations about the best way of solving some of those structural barriers. Certainly we've learnt a lot from about fundraising and mentoring from what happens in the Democrats in the States.
Robert, thank you very much for your question. Lady here halfway back with the flowery top on.
Hello, I'm Sarah Rees from the Women's Equality Network Wales. My question is, could you tell me what one piece of advice you would give to women looking to enter politics?
Well, I'd certainly repeat the Alan Milburn piece of advice about being very clear about your purpose and actually writing it down. There's, you know, when you see why people put themselves forward for politics, I mean, there's all sorts of motivations. At the end of the day, I think most people who go into politics go in with a, you know, great sense that they want to change the world. I think people go in with good heart. But I think you need to be sharper about your sense of purpose than just, I want to change the world. You've got to be clear about what it is that's motivating you. Because if you think the applause is going to sustain you in politics, well, there'll absolutely be days when people aren't applauding. You know, the celebrity culture around it at the end of the day is a very hollow one. So it's really only that sense of purpose that's going to sustain you. So I'd certainly say that. I'd also say it's very important to be clear about your sense of self. And once again, I think that's advice not just for people talking about going into politics, but in our world generally. I mean, a teenage girl can look at social media and see the most vile things written about her. And if she's going to allow her sense of self to be hostage to that, then there'll be some very hard days ahead. I think we've all got to have a sense of self that is nurtured, not through the reflection of social media or the media in general. Now, that doesn't mean people should be immune to constructive criticism, but let's face it, you know, the person on a Friday night alcohol binge who decides to tweet at midnight is probably not putting that together with a great constructive analytical mindset. And, you know, at the end of the day, should you let the pissed ravings of some lunatic actually impact into your sense of self? I don't think you should. So I think that's very important, knowing who you are, kind of isolated from this hurly-burly that can go on around you.
I don't think anyone here falls into that category on Twitter. It's okay.
Hopefully not.
You talk about the sense of self and the sense of purpose and that piece of paper. What was on that piece of paper?
Well, helpfully, it's reproduced in my book.
There we go.
So, yes, the crumpled, creased piece of paper was got out and reproduced into the book. But it talks about the big things that ended up being the policy themes of my prime ministership, about education and opportunity, about work and about respect. So I hope that people would look at it and say that I stayed true to it during the days of my prime ministership.
You can see it in the book. Over here on the left.
Should just say this is truly terrifying for me now, because this is Rachel, who used to work for me
Don't worry,
when I was Prime Minister.
I'm not going to reveal anything.
So any stories could come out at this point.
She was a great female boss, I can tell you that. Have you had a chance to speak to Hillary Clinton about sexism and what she might face if she becomes the first president of the United States? And what did she think about your misogyny speech, if you did have a chat?
I've had the opportunity to talk to Hillary on more than one occasion about gender issues, and very nicely she referred to my experience in her book as something that made her reflect on gender issues. I think Hillary is pretty worldly wise when it comes to these things. Of the things that happened to me, some of the gendered insults actually weren't even original. They were recycled insults because they'd been thrown at Hillary Clinton during the course of her campaign the last time round when she was campaigning in the primaries. So I think she and I are of a pretty similar mind about the need to point out sexism and to try and push this gendered conversation out of the debate. When I faced some political issues around, dredging up matters associated with my personal life, 20 years before I was in politics, she certainly gave me some advice, having faced the Whitewater scandal when she and Bill Clinton were in the White House, some very practical advice about dealing with it early and comprehensively. So I think there is this lively exchange. I certainly hope, I'm an unashamed Hillary fan, and I certainly hope she comes through as President of the United States. And amongst all of the reasons I hope for that, I think she would be fantastic at the job, her skills and capabilities and attributes, her values. But amongst all of those reasons, I think the symbolism at this time in the life of our planet for the US to have a woman as a leader would be tremendous and would reverberate around our world. So certainly, fingers crossed, and let's hope she gets there.
I wonder if she'll have a piece of paper in her pocket. Over here on the left, third row back, just to give us a chance to get to you with the microphone, if you may. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Carol Ann Davis, Chief Executive of the Design Commission for Wales. In a lot of these debates, common themes are about lack of confidence, not leaning in, not beefing up your CV, perhaps in the same way your male colleagues were. But recently, reflecting on this, I was warned also to expect female resistance and to look out for women who pull up the ladder, to use Susan Greenfield's term. Do you have any reflections on that, and perhaps any advice of almost the enemy within, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a very hard thing, and it certainly does happen. It certainly does happen that you have, women for whom the status of being the only one or a very few number of women becomes part of their sense of identity, and they don't actually want to facilitate more women coming through. I think it's, rarer than the number of women who want to reach out and bring more women through, but a very complex problem when it happens. And I don't think I've got, the kind of absolute suggestion to fix it. I think trying to talk things through with people matters, and why the fact that there are more women doesn't necessarily need to derogate from a sense of respect given to the women who have got there first. Having that conversation matters. But really beyond that, I don't have any great tactics or strategy, I'm sorry. One of the great things about Joan Kirner, who I've referred to, she, I think in many walks of life, even before you get to the gender dynamic, in many walks of life, there's a tendency for the older generation to look at the newer generation and say, they're not as good as we were. We were better at it than they were. I think that's a very common reflection. One of Joan's great strengths was she always looked at the people coming through and was in awe of their capabilities and eager to see the next generation and the next generation, and for there to be more and more women. So a spirit of generosity. And I think pointing to role models who have had that spirit of generosity might be a little bit of the solution too.
Thank you very much for your question. We've got a hand up on the right there in the middle. Yeah.
Meena Upadhyay. If you were to be the Prime Minister again, what would you do differently?
Well, there's, once you're done, you're done. So there's no again in that sentence. I talk in my book about a range of sort of political policy matters, messaging and approaches that I would do differently. But they sort of very much turn on Australian political circumstances. To talk more broadly about what I'd do differently, I'd certainly try and deal with the issue of sexism and gender earlier in the life of my Prime Ministership. And I'd certainly try and carve out more time for, quiet thinking and reflection. I thought that I was carving out time. We used to refer to it as, being in the cone. I was going to be in the cone, of course, a reference to Maxwell Smart, in the cone of silence. How else would you describe your practice as Prime Minister except with a Maxwell Smart reference? So I'd say going into the cone, I don't want to be disturbed, and I'd buy myself some quiet time and thinking time. But with the benefit of reflection, I didn't do that often enough or for long enough. And not just quiet time, absolutely by yourself, but with the best of your colleagues. And I think, that's a lesson that holds well for people generally in our world. I mean, I think across all of human history, the urgent has been the enemy of the important. But never before in human history has the urgent been so privileged over the important. It beeps and buzzes at you and demands your attention almost 24 hours a day. And to put all of that aside and to really find deep thinking time is a struggle for everyone. And so I would certainly recommend more of that.
Thank you very much. Do we have time for a couple more, Rosemary? I'm looking to... do we have time for a couple more, Julie?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
The lady with the blonde hair just in the middle row there.
You all look sort of glowing with this sun on you.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
It's very nice seeing.
Thank you. Alison Phillips, Deputy Older People's Commissioner for Wales. What motivation or inspiration have you taken from older women that you have met in your life? And what is the positive contribution that older women can continue to make in society?
Oh, well, certainly my mum, along with my father, but my mum was a source of support and inspiration throughout all of this journey, and happily still with us in Adelaide. Joan, who I've spoken about a great deal, was a source of support and inspiration too. And so I think that there is a real role for older women who are, perhaps beyond the rigours of full-time work. I mean, Joan did that stage version of retirement. She went from, full-time 100% politics to focusing on the affirmative action rule and Emily's List, and then sort of shaded out of those things over time. Because she had a bit more time and a bit more space, she could be a very good mentor and guide, and I think a lot of older women are in a position to do that and to support younger women through. So I would hope that sense of connection can be fostered. And there is something very reassuring about being able to talk to someone who's seen it go past before. And certainly in politics there are cycles, and a seasoned political person can say to the whoever is experiencing it for the first time, look, I remember when 15 years ago the cycle was a bit like this, and this is what we did to cope with it. It can be a very reassuring thing.
Wise words, thank you. Just in the front here.
Former Member of Parliament, Joy Ying.
Sorry.
Sian James, former Member of Parliament, and enjoying my life. But one of the things that struck me when I got to Westminster was the overconfidence of my male colleagues. And we as women spent our whole time concentrating on the things that we knew we could do. And you touched upon that a little earlier in your speech. I have a 12-year-old granddaughter whom I adore, and I wanted to grow up to be a confident woman. What's the one bit of advice that you think I should give her?
I actually think children have an inherent sense of possibility, and we, the world around them, sort of imprint the limitations on them. And there's plenty of research, and certainly in Cheryl's book, Lean In, and there's a vast body of literature on this, even for grandparents and parents who think that they're not bringing up their children in a gendered way, there's, when they do the research, they do find that, a girl who is marshalling the other children, you must play the ball game this way, you're going to do this and you're going to do that, will be quickly referred to as bossy, where a male child who's actually, getting all the kids organised to play a little game of football in a particular way won't be. He'll just be, seen as kind of being a boy. That girls will be told off for being talkative, even though they're actually taking up not any more airtime than boys are taking up. Cheryl in the book refers to the ability at Walmart to buy little T-shirts, and there's one for a boy that says smart like daddy, and one for a girl that says pretty like mummy. By the time we're there, we're imprinting limitations on our children. So I think if we can be conscious of that, and I'd be trying to point her towards, kind of quite loud role models. I think some of them are out there, and that's, a good thing to aspire for, that it shouldn't be about a sense of keeping the peace or reserve, but it's okay to be pretty quarrelsome and pretty feisty.
Sian, thank you very much indeed. And I think that's a really fitting place to end with that advice for the future and for the next generation and for our children. Julia, thank you very much. And I'm sure you will give her a warm round of applause for all the insights this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, expectations were high and expectations have been exceeded. They're not basking in the glory of the sun, they're basking in being your presence, I think. Julia, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Really an exceptional evening. And of course, I think we're talking to the converted here, but I think hopefully they'll all be now motivated to move out and encourage more women and young men to come forward, not just to politics, public life. I'd like to thank Andrea very much, because trying to control a crowd like this is quite difficult.
They're very rowdy, aren't they?
But thank you so much. You've added a lot to this evening. So what's come from tonight, you must go and buy the book, because it really is a fantastic read. Julia, I think you've been just magnificent. You've given so much of your time today. Lunchtime, we were 20-odd women who had a real insight into what it's like to be Julia Gillard. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Wales.
Thank you.
I know that Tim is staying to see the Ashes. I hope we don't win, but never mind. And I'm sure if your father was alive, he would be very proud of you now. I am very proud to be the first woman presiding officer. I hope I won't be the last, and I hope that the women here today and the men will make sure that you become mentors, and even a mentee, in fact, because what you can give to other people is great. I mean, you really do enjoy, getting out there and showing that your experience is really sometimes quite helpful to people. So it's been a great delight. I'm so pleased that you've come. All these smiling faces is really very worrying, I'm not used to it in this building. But Julia, thank you very much indeed. And do get the book and do come back again.
Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was fantastic. Well done. Thank you. Thank you.